A toothache killed more people in colonial America than most would ever admit. Not eventually, not indirectly. A single tooth, rotting quietly inside someone's mouth. And within weeks, that person was gone. No warning, no cure, no way out. And the most terrifying part of all of this? Nobody understood why it kept happening. The connection between a decaying molar and a dead body was invisible to everyone around it. Doctors, families, neighbors. They watched people deteriorate and had no idea what they were actually looking at. This is the story that colonial America never told. The one hiding behind every sunken face and every portrait, every death record that says fever, when the truth started somewhere much smaller. Welcome to Stories of the Old World. Stay with me. Because what you're about to hear is going to make you look at something completely ordinary in a way you never have before. Let's go back to the beginning, not to a specific date on a calendar, but to a feeling. Picture a small wooden home somewhere along the eastern coast of North America. The year is somewhere around 1700. Outside, the world is moving. Boston is growing. Philadelphia is taking shape. The British colonies are stretching their legs, trading, building, arguing, praying. There's ambition in the air. There's possibility. But inside that wooden house, someone is not sleeping. A man, maybe in his late 30s, sits hunched near the fire. His jaw is swollen on the right side, the skin tight and warm to the touch. He hasn't eaten properly in 4 days. Every time he chews, a deep grinding ache radiates up through his jaw and into his temple behind his right eye. The pain doesn't come in waves, it stays. A constant low roar that occasionally spikes into something blinding. His wife watches him from across the room. There is no one to call. There is no one who specializes in this kind of problem. There is a barber in the next town who has pulled teeth before. The man knows what that visit will look like. He's seen it done to others. He puts it off for another 3 days. This scene played out tens of thousands of times across colonial America. The toothache was one of the most common, most feared, and least talked about forms of suffering in the entire era. And understanding why it was so devastating starts with understanding what people were actually eating. The colonial diet, especially from the mid-1600s onward, was quietly destroying people's teeth from the inside out. The culprit wasn't complicated. It was sugar. Not sugar in the modern sense of a candy aisle. Molasses specifically. A byproduct of sugarcane production in the Caribbean, it flooded the colonial market because it was cheap, calorie-dense, and easy to ship. It made its way into bread, puddings, and the daily drinks that colonists consumed instead of water. Rum was made from it. Hard cider was sweetened with it. Children drank it in warm water every morning. Clean drinking water was genuinely difficult to come by. The risk of waterborne disease was real, so people drank fermented things instead, which meant that from the first years of a colonial child's life, their teeth were bathed constantly in sugar and acid. And nobody was cleaning those teeth. Not in any meaningful way. And the more prosperous colonists might use a small rag wrapped around a stick, dipped in crushed charcoal or salt. This was considered thorough hygiene. The majority didn't even do that. There was no understanding of what bacteria were doing inside the mouth. No concept of plaque. Just the slow, invisible rot working its way through tooth after tooth, year after year. Archaeologists who have excavated colonial-era cemeteries have found something that tells this story without words. Adult skulls, particularly those of people over 35, show consistent evidence of decay. Deep cavities in the enamel, missing teeth, and most chillingly, damage to the jawbone itself where abscesses had eaten through the bone. The infection wasn't just in the teeth, it had gone deeper. And that is where this story stops being about discomfort and starts being about survival. Before we go further, think about this. If you had lived in colonial America, how do you think you would have handled a week of relentless tooth pain with absolutely no way to treat it? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and the answers might surprise you. Here's what most people don't understand about a tooth infection. It doesn't stay in the tooth. A cavity, left alone, eats through the hard outer layers and eventually reaches the soft inner pulp. Once infection reaches the pulp, bacteria have access to the bloodstream. The body fights back, and the result is an abscess, a pressurized pocket of infection building up at the root or inside the gum and jaw tissue. For a colonial-era person, this process moved without mercy. Or the jaw would begin to swell, the fever would come, the face would puff out, hot and rigid. Eating became impossible. Sleep became impossible. The pain radiated into the skull, down the neck, behind the eyes, and then, in some cases, something worse happened. If an abscess in the lower jaw was left untreated long enough, the infection could spread into the connective tissue of the neck. The floor of the mouth would swell. The throat would tighten. This condition, which doctors today call Ludwig's angina, can close off the airway entirely. People suffocated, not from a wound, not from disease in the conventional sense, from a tooth. Our records from colonial America are scattered with deaths listed as fever, swelling of the face, or inflammation of the jaw. Historians and medical researchers now believe a significant number of these were dental infections that spread beyond the point of no return. The people writing those death records didn't know to look in the mouth. Which brings us to the man people turned to when the pain became unbearable. There was no dentist. Let that sit for a moment. The word existed in theory. The concept was discussed in certain European medical circles. But in colonial America, if you needed a tooth pulled, you went to the barber. The barber-surgeon was a genuine profession. The same man who trimmed your hair and shaved your face was also, when called upon, responsible for minor surgery, bloodletting, wound treatment, for in-tooth extraction. In larger cities, a general surgeon might be available. In rural areas, the task fell to whoever had strong hands and a steady enough nerve. The primary tool was a device called a pelican. Picture a metal rod, about the length of your forearm, with a curved arm near the tip. That curved arm would hook around the tooth, and the barber would use it as a lever, cranking with controlled force to work the tooth loose. Later in the 1700s, a rudimentary forceps appeared, allowing for more direct traction. But teeth don't simply slide out. They're anchored by roots that can be curved, multiple, or fused to the surrounding bone. Extractions frequently involved fractures of the tooth, of the root left behind in the socket to cause its own infection later, sometimes of the jaw itself. Was there anything to dull the pain? And the answer is yes, but not much. Cloves were the most effective remedy available. The active compound in clove oil, eugenol, has a genuine mild numbing effect on nerve tissue. Colonial barbers and patients knew this not from chemistry, but from generations of experience. It was not enough, but it was something. Rum was administered before extractions, partly as a sedative, partly as a social ritual acknowledging what was about to happen. A man would take a generous drink, sit down in a wooden chair, and grip the armrests. The barber would stand behind him. Sometimes the patient's head was held between the barber's knees to keep it from moving. A family member might hold the patient's arms because the body doesn't cooperate with being hurt, even when the mind consents. The extraction took seconds or minutes depending on the tooth. The patient yelled or didn't. Sometimes they fainted. The socket bled openly, and the standard aftercare was a rag pressed against the wound until it slowed. No sutures, no sterile dressing, no antibiotics. And then you walked home. If you're quietly grateful for modern medicine right now, you're not alone. That feeling is exactly what this story is about. And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. George Washington lost almost every tooth he had. This is one of the most documented dental histories in colonial American records, and it tells the story of an entire era more powerfully than any statistics could. Washington began losing teeth in his 20s. By the time he was inaugurated as the first president of the United States in 1789, he had exactly one natural tooth remaining. The rest had been extracted over decades of pain, infection, and inadequate treatment. He wore dentures for most of his adult life, and here is where the popular myth needs correcting. His dentures were not made of wood. Wood would have rotted almost immediately. Washington's dentures were constructed from human teeth, animal teeth, and carved ivory from hippo and elephant tusks. The human teeth were, in some documented cases, purchased from enslaved people on his own plantation at Mount Vernon. These individuals, with no meaningful ability to refuse, surrendered their teeth for their enslavers' prosthetics. Washington paid them small sums that did not reflect the power imbalance behind the transaction. His dentures never fit well. No denture of that era did. They were carved and fitted by hand. I adjusted repeatedly, but the technology simply didn't exist to properly replicate natural tooth structure. His face in portraits showed the characteristic sunken appearance of someone whose jaw has been altered by significant tooth loss. His speech was affected. Eating was a careful, private act. He described toothaches in his personal letters with the weary resignation of someone for whom chronic pain had become part of the landscape of daily life. Not a crisis anymore, just the weather. And Washington was among the most privileged men on the continent. He had access to the best barber-surgeons available. He could afford ivory dentures. He had people managing his care. Imagine then what it looked like for everyone else. The colonial population was overwhelmingly rural. In farming communities scattered across Virginia, the Carolinas, our Pennsylvania, and the frontier edges of New England, there was often no barber within a day's ride. When a tooth became unbearable, the options narrowed fast. Folk remedies were the first line of defense. Clove oil had real effect. A poultice of warm tobacco pressed against the cheek offered heat-based relief. Rinsing with spirits might temporarily blunt the edge of the pain. Some communities used herbal bark infusions, drawing on knowledge borrowed or stolen from indigenous peoples who had developed sophisticated botanical medicine over centuries. The Puritans of New England added a theological dimension to this suffering. Pain, in their worldview, was not merely physical, it was spiritual. Enduring toothache without complaint was an act of faith. Seeking excessive relief suggested weakness of character. A man who screamed too loudly during an extraction might be judged for it afterward. This mindset was woven into the daily life of entire communities. The body was supposed to suffer. The soul was supposed to endure. Meanwhile, in communities of enslaved people across the southern colonies, dental suffering was compounded by a complete absence of care. Enslaved individuals had no access to barber-surgeons, no money for remedies, no autonomy over their own bodies. Their teeth decayed untreated. Their abscesses went unaddressed. And in a documented horror, their healthy teeth were sometimes extracted without consent to be sold to white colonists who needed them for dentures. This was advertised in newspapers. At the time, it was considered an unremarkable commercial transaction. The Pennsylvania Gazette ran advertisements from traveling tooth operators who arrived in town for a few days, offered extractions and basic denture fitting, and then moved on. These men were not dentists. Some had picked up the craft by watching others. Others were simply opportunists who knew that pain makes people desperate. Pain in colonial America followed the same fault lines that pain always follows: class, race, and gender. Women carried a particular burden. The colonial phrase, "a tooth for every child," was not a metaphor. It was a clinical observation. Pregnancy demands calcium, and when a woman's diet couldn't provide enough, the body took it from tooth enamel. Women who bore multiple children, which was the norm, often lost multiple teeth with each pregnancy. By their mid-30s, many colonial women had mouths that were half empty. Children were not spared. Molasses given to infants rotted their primary teeth before they were old enough to understand what was happening. There was no concept that baby teeth needed protecting. The damage accumulated silently, year after year. While wealthy colonists suffered from dental disease, they at least had options. They could afford the barber-surgeon. They could afford clove oil and spirits. They could afford dentures, however imperfect. The poor had none of this. They had the pain and they had time, and that was all. Before the century turned, a quiet shift began. In 1728, a French surgeon named Pierre Fauchard published Le Chirurgien Dentiste, the first systematic attempt to treat dentistry as a distinct medical discipline. Fauchard described extraction techniques, ways to fill cavities with lead and tin alloys, and methods for constructing better-fitting dental prosthetics. By the standards of his time, he was visionary. His ideas crossed the Atlantic slowly, but by the mid-1700s in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, small numbers of practitioners began advertising themselves specifically as tooth operators or dental surgeons. Then there is Paul Revere. Most people know him from A Midnight Ride in 1775. Fewer know that he was a silversmith who made dentures, and that in 1776 he performed one of the earliest documented cases of forensic dentistry on the North American continent. The body of a general killed in battle needed identification. Revere recognized the prosthetic bridge he had made for the man years earlier. A mouth became evidence. A craftsman became briefly a forensic investigator. The most sophisticated dental work available was being done by a silversmith on the side. The craft was still searching for a professional identity. That identity would not fully arrive for another century. The world's first dedicated dental school, the Baltimore College of Dental Surgery, opened in 1840. Until that moment, there was no formal training, no licensing, no standard of care. There was just the pain, and whoever happened to be nearest with a pair of forceps. One final thought before we close this chapter of history. We live in an era of such extraordinary medical capability that we have in some ways lost the ability to feel grateful for it. A cavity today is a minor inconvenience. An abscessed tooth is treated with antibiotics and a root canal, manageable, predictable, survivable. The tools exist. The knowledge exists. None of it was always there. For the people of colonial America, a single tooth going bad was a descent into weeks of suffering that could and sometimes did end in death. Their jawbones carry those stories for archaeologists to read centuries later. Their letters carry the exhaustion. Their portraits carry the sunken faces of people who lost too much of what holds a face together. What strikes me most is not how different their lives were from ours. It's how familiar the pain sounds. That nighttime ache pressing behind the eye, the desperate pressing of fingers against a cheek, the dread of what has to happen next. The feeling is the same. Only the century has changed. Next time you sit in that dentist chair, knuckles white, waiting for the needle, remember the man by the fire in 1700. Remember that what you're dreading is the cure. Ma, for him, there was none. And if something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. What part of colonial life do you think people today would find hardest to handle? Drop it in the comments. Not just the dentistry, the whole picture. There's another story waiting for you right now on this channel. Different era, different world, same truth. History is stranger, harder, and more human than we were ever taught. Go find it.